Snow fell in thick, hunched curtains that night, muting the valley into a world of glass and hush. It was supposed to be Christmas Eve, calendar lights in warm living rooms, candles in laps. But the map of 2025 had been redrawn by war. The city lay in the skeletal remains of its own buildings, facades torn like paper, streets narrowed to rubble. Even the stars seemed reluctant to look down. Captain Elena Ward moved through this ruined geography like a ghost in uniform. She had not wanted to be a soldier. Her first oath, sworn under fluorescent lights and the smell of isopropyl, had been to do no harm. She had trained as a combat medic, a healer who stitched flesh and steadied the breath of those who had no other place to belong. Yet fate, loud and indifferent, had given her another skill, one she had tried to hide from herself, a precision with a rifle that could bend the physics of a situation to advantage. Men and women who had watched her work in the field began to call her Dr. Sniper. The name stuck because it told a story of contradiction, and stories spread faster than strategy. On that night, the story was simple and terrible. Word came through encrypted channels, an enemy emplacement, an advanced missile platform that could be fired remotely, sat camouflaged on a ridge 2 kilometers away. It had been moved into place under cover of darkness. Reconnaissance confirmed the system was active, primed to launch within minutes. The coordinates appeared on a tablet passed from hand to hand like a confession. No drone could thread the angle without detection. No jets could arrive in time. The chain of command weighed options like lead in a scale and found none that would save the shelters in town below. "Elena," the commander said, when he found her by the medical tent. He did not ask whether she would do it. He asked whether she could. His voice was not triumphant, only exhausted. "We need you to make a shot nobody thinks possible." Her palms went cold. The rifle she had kept wrapped in a tarp for months felt suddenly too close, a living thing that demanded she reconcile what she'd always done with what she must now do. She had sewn up a boy whose lungs had collapsed from shrapnel. She had wiped blood from a woman who would never walk again. Killing was not part of the ledger she kept by candlelight, yet there was a different ledger that measured consequence, and in its columns, the missile platform's launch would be a line with many zeros after it. Outside, the air smelled of metal and smoke, and somewhere a bell, old, cracked, ticked in a ruined church. Elena nodded. The nod was small. It was the kind of assent that folds a life into 2 halves. She took the rifle because to refuse would be to choose the arithmetic of death for hundreds. She took the rifle because someone had to convert an impossible angle into one small, precise act. She crawled through the ruined streets toward a vantage point, a collapsed watchtower that offered the only line of sight. With every step, memories crowded the tunnel of her mind. A childhood Christmas when her father taught her to steady on a stock, the laugh in his throat when she placed the sight true, the medic tent in which she had promised to keep breathing alive. The past was a soft thing pressed into the harder present. When she reached the watchtower, the wind cut her cheeks raw. Soldiers around her whispered plans like prayers, trading numbers and probabilities and quick apologies. Someone pressed a hot metal flask into her hands. She exhaled, and the breath puffed white into the night. The valley lay below like a map of wrong choices, and somewhere on a distant ridge, a system hummed with lethal possibility. Elena checked her equipment with methodical care, not because habit comforted her, but because moments of consequence do not forgive carelessness. She set the bipod, adjusted the scope, felt the cool metal rest against her cheek. War had taught her many things, but the most important was that decisions were often impossible until someone made them possible. In the silence before action, she allowed herself a single thought, an almost childish petition for the kind of mercy that comes in moments when the world seems otherwise certain to collapse. She breathed and prepared to measure the space between a chance and a miracle. From her perch within the shell of the watchtower, Elena could see the valley's skeletal contour, and with the aid of equipment and map overlays, the faint gray of the ridge where the missile system crouched. The distance was the first enemy, 2 kilometers of open winter and ruin. The second enemy was wind, capricious, slicing, and impossible to predict in a canyon of ruined buildings that redirected gusts into whiplashes. The third enemy was visibility. Snow blurred distances in layered veils, and darkness had a way of swallowing reference points that scopes relied on. And beyond all these, the human factor, Elena's own hands, which remembered stitches and bandages more readily than the weight of a rifle trigger. She set the scope and began the calculations she had been avoiding. Ballistics is not poetry. It is arithmetic applied to air, distance measures, elevation adjustments, Coriolis drift, expected wind at different strata. Soldiers around her spoke in numbers as if that would make the moment less monstrous. She adjusted for temperature because cold air is denser. She compensated for the slope of the valley because projectiles arc differently when they are hunting a target perched above. Her breath slowed as she calculated, until counting in her head replaced the roar in her chest. Memory offered its own counsel. She thought of her father's hands, how they guided her small fingers on a winter porch so long ago, the way he taught steadiness as a kind of kindness. She thought of the medic's oath, and how saving lives sometimes required choosing between the bad and the worse. She thought of the shelter in town below, families who had trusted the soldiers to keep them safe on a night meant for celebration. She allowed herself the steady, practical mantra she had learned in field hospitals. Focus on what you can change, accept what you cannot. And then the impossible variables began to move. A gust, unexpected, funneled down the valley like a living thing. Snow swirled in a sudden eddy that blanked out a slit of the sky. Elena's calculated adjustments shifted before she could finalize them. She recalculated. A drone farther back reported interference, a thermal distortion, suggesting that the structure of collapsed buildings had created microclimates and wind tunnels. That meant her earlier numbers could be wrong by meters that would decide life or death. The human factor tightened. She could feel the tremor start in her hands, not from doubt exactly, but from the strain of holding a life or death equation in her palm. She tightened her cheek against the stock. Every muscle had to become a tool of mathematics, not emotion. She mapped the wind's probable direction, visualized the arc not as a line but as a living curve that might be pinched or stretched by gusts. She adjusted the windage knob another fraction. She rechecked the mil dots. The minutes felt like hours. Between two bursts of artillery, a pocket of still air opened, a narrow, fragile corridor that cut through the chaos of weather. It appeared and disappeared like a held breath. Elena's mouth filled with the metallic taste of adrenaline. For a fraction of time that would later be measured in seconds and retold as fate, the geometry of the shot aligned in a way that made the improbable something she could attempt. She didn't feel triumph. She felt the cold clarity of duty. If the world were simpler, perhaps someone else would have stepped forward. But simplicity had been stripped away the day the missiles had been mounted. Elena knew that taking the shot meant carrying consequences she would shoulder alone, memories of the muzzle report, the knowledge that one trigger pull could save many and still feel like a different kind of taking. The ledgers of her life rearranged that night into a single column. She closed her eye, then opened both, sighting down the scope. Her finger found the trigger. The impossible had not become possible because of a miracle yet. It had become possible because she had calculated, steadied, and chosen to act within the brittle window the weather had given her. She aligned the crosshairs and let her heartbeat find a tempo that matched the world's sudden smallness. Time compresses under such focus. The canyon's roar receded until the only audible things were the whisper of wind against metal and the mechanical clocking of her own pulse. Every technique she had ever learned as a sniper, breath control, trigger squeeze, follow-through, folded into this single action, but there was more now than training. There was the weight of a town's sleeping breath, the faces of families in shelters who had not chosen war, and the memory of a father's lesson that steadiness is an act of care. She breathed in slowly, timed to the mechanical rhythm she'd practiced in the dim lights of field hospitals. 1 breath to calm, 2 to center, 3 to release. When the breath was exact, she applied pressure to the trigger. The report was immediate and final, a clean, bright crack splitting the night. The recoil stepped through her shoulder. For a single stretched second, she could not tell if the aim had been true. Then came the distant answer, a bloom of light on the ridge like a small, controlled sunrise. The missile system shuddered and collapsed inward, its optics severed, its guidance disrupted. The launch sequence failed. The men in the town below stared up as the sky that might have been filled with fire remained a wounded, peaceful black. Radios crackled and then stilled as commanders across the line digested what had happened. Soldiers clustered around Elena's position watched her rather than the distant flash. Some wept, not from joy but from the spent release of terror. Others were speechless in reverent disbelief. The medic who had given Elena the flask earlier stepped forward, his face ashen. "You did it," he breathed. The words felt insufficient, but they were all anyone could say. Word traveled fast in a war zone. The impossible becomes legend quicker than the body can rest. By morning, what military analysts would later call a highly improbable confluence of ballistic factors had already been reframed by people who needed poetry more than physics. A lone woman's shot, made in one breath on Christmas Eve, had prevented a slaughter. Reporters on safer networks picked up the story, and social feeds bloomed with versions of the moment. For those who had been there, though, the reality was less tidy than headlines. Elena did not feel like a hero. She felt like someone who had done exactly what was required and then found that the cost of doing so would be carried forward, quietly, every time she closed her eyes. Later interviews would attempt to reduce the night to quotes and carefully edited footage. Soldiers would offer witness accounts, how the valley had seemed to hold its breath, how some men on the opposite ridge lowered their heads as if in mourning, and radio logs would capture the flurry of orders and the subsequent pause. They would call it the Christmas miracle shot, a phrase that pleased neither the medic in the field nor the scientists who would later try to explain its mechanics. For Elena, it remained a collection of small impressions, the sting of cold, the metallic taste in her mouth, the recoil on her shoulder, the sudden absurd light on the ridge like an answer someone had thrown back at the night. She lowered her rifle when the immediate danger passed. Hands, calloused, trembling, thankful, reached for her in the collapsing quiet. She didn't smile. Her mouth was too full of the knowledge that one action could ripple outward in ways she could not fully predict. She thought of the people in the shelters and felt a fierce, private relief that they would wake to a day where children would not pay for political calculations. The shot had been fired, and in that fired instant, the ledger had swung toward life rather than annihilation. But the ledger's swinging was not a clean thing. It left edges and cuts that time would heal awkwardly, if at all. When dawn lifted over the ruined rooftops, it brought with it a light less ragged than any the town had expected. The missile emplacement lay in ruined silence. The launch that had threatened catastrophe had been prevented. Messages flowed through command channels, ceasefire requests, tactical reevaluations, and in some controversial sectors, spontaneous gestures of restraint. Soldiers on both sides reported a strange hesitance, as if the night's violent potential had been interrupted by something that neither machine nor man could quite categorize. In low places, around field stoves and shared fires, men who had been enemies a few hours earlier exchanged cigarettes and stories instead of orders. Word of the shot and its consequences spread out like rings on water. Civilian networks shared images and accounts of frightened families who had not known whether to hope. Religious leaders spoke of the night in terms that merged doctrine with gratitude. Analysts tried to quantitate the tactical shift, noting that the prevented launch changed troop movements and removed a point of escalation that would have provoked retaliation. They pointed to lowered casualty numbers and the slender possibility that a wider engagement had been averted. For the people who had lived the night, the statistics mattered less than the fact of waking. Elena was reticent in the face of sudden public attention. Soldiers pushed her toward commendations and interviews, but she moved back toward the medical tent, toward the work she felt could atone in practical ways for what she had been forced to do. She stitched, tended feverish children, and administered morphine to those whose bodies needed it. Reporters knocked at the tent door and recorded what they could find of her reticence, a woman who refused medals, who would say only that she had done what needed to be done. Later, when asked whether she believed a miracle had occurred, she offered a reply that balanced skepticism and gratitude. "I don't know if it was a miracle. I know it was a narrow window, and I know someone had to take it." Communities far from the front adopted the story into their seasonal narratives. Candles were lit in unfamiliar places for the Christmas shot and the lives it had saved. For veterans and families, the tale became a small talisman of hope, that amid systemic cruelty there could be acts of singular courage that altered the course of events. In a conflict that had been measured in attrition, This one decisive act reintroduced the idea of moral agency into a conversation drowning in numbers. Yet even goodwill carried complications. The political apparatus that grew around the story argued for particular uses of it. Propaganda in some places, proof of valiant resistance in others. Elena watched these intellectual wrestlings with distaste. To her, the moment had not been about headlines or leverage. It had been about a calculus that ended with lives spared. She refused to be a symbol on a poster board. She wanted only to return to the tent and to the slow, quiet work of tending wounds. The immediate effects were tangible. Shelters reported survivors who might have otherwise been casualties. Some units used the lull to negotiate temporary exchanges of medical supplies. In certain sectors, the truce held long enough to allow evacuation of non-combatants. The ripple extended into policy debates. Commanders recalibrated risk assessments. Lawmakers asked for more transparency about high-risk weapons deployments. And some international mediators invoked the event as a reason to push for de-escalation. The shot had become a pivot point, a moment around which narratives turned. Emergency rooms, parliamentary halls, and families at kitchen tables, all telling versions of the same story. For Elena, the aftermath was quieter. She kept the rifle in a canvas wrap and returned to her original oath, only now shaded by knowledge she could not relinquish. She lit a small candle each evening for those who had been spared and for those who bore scars of the night. She resumed patching wounds and delivering quiet reassurances to the living. The legend would grow, as legends do, in ways beyond her control. She learned to live alongside it, not entirely embracing the halo that others placed over her head, but not denying the fact that one action, taken with deliberate care, had rearranged the danger into a chance. Months later, the story would be analyzed in laboratories and debated in policy briefings. Ballistics experts reconstructed trajectories and cataloged the atmospheric peculiarities that had, in combination, produced the narrow, safe corridor that night. They spoke of thermal inversions, eddy currents carved by building ruins, and the near-impossible alignment of vector forces. Statisticians ran simulations and assigned probabilities that dwindled into improbability. Ethicists parsed whether such acts should be valorized when they inhabit moral gray. These technical dissections were useful. They gave a language to the event that could be shared across disciplines. Still, science could only take the story so far. The human heart insisted on meaning beyond equations. People remembered the night in ways that were not reducible to mechanics. A child who would never light a Yule log without thinking of the woman who had kept her safe. An old man who had put down his rifle and mended a sodden enemy uniform in a makeshift gesture of shared grief. The event became less a single point and more a knot tying together disparate lives. Elena herself never claimed divine intervention. She accepted that she had been part of a convergence. Preparation met opportunity, skill met a narrow window of weather, and the ethical calculus of a medic-turned-shooter had resolved in a single, irreversible act. Yet she also acknowledged the human tendency to call such convergences miracles, because people need language that expresses wonder when the cold facts do not suffice. Her legacy then was twofold. On one level, she inspired technical studies, papers in journals, presentations in symposiums, tactical adjustments in military manuals about how weather and urban ruin could interact to produce unexpected ballistic effects. On another level, she inspired personal transformations, letters from parents who had felt their prayers answered, postcards from veterans who had rethought what courage meant. Schools taught the story as a moral puzzle, how to weigh sacrificial choices against the impetus to preserve life. In quieter retrospects, Elena would sit with students and with new medics and say something simple, that courage is not a single grand act, but a series of smaller commitments that sometimes culminate in one visible moment. She urged people to recognize the fractal nature of moral action. Small kindnesses build muscle for larger ones. She counseled against fetishizing violence. The shot had saved lives, but it had also left its mark on those who fired it. Each Christmas afterward, she lit the same small candle. She didn't speak of miracles, only of choices. The choice to stand, to aim, to take responsibility when the world narrows to a single question. The town below grew back slowly, as towns do, with more careful designs and memorial plaques. People came each year to the edge of the ridge to lay wreaths, not to honor the weaponry, but to remember the lives preserved in the fragile human thread that had tied them through a night of snow. When asked what she hoped others would take from the story, she answered plainly that when we are called to act, we should do so with moral clarity and skill. That hope is not only a feeling, it's a practice. And for many, that became the truest measure of the so-called Christmas miracle, the idea that even in a world capable of great ruin, a single act of deliberate courage can bend the arc of events toward life.